Hey everybody, this is Kevin at Fiveable, and tonight we're looking at logical fallacies part 2. Last week we looked at the first half of the 15 most common logical fallacies. So I'll spend the first few minutes tonight looking at why logical fallacies are important for AP Lang, and then we'll spend the rest of the night unpacking the other half, the second half of the most common logical fallacies. So as always, if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask them, and I will get to them by the end of the night. Next week, we are going to start our synthesis unit. And that'll take us pretty much through the month of February. Logical fallacies, in essence, are bad logic or faulty logic. So I'm going to take the first 2 minutes here very quickly to rehash why they're important for our class AP Language and Composition. Again, it's not about the names. Sometimes it's nice and you sound really smart to know these names, and great, but what really matters is that you can identify flawed logic in your own writing or in someone else's writing. So the most common types have names. Again, we looked at half of them last week, and we'll look at the second half of the most common logical fallacies this week. Again, it's not so much about memorizing and matching. That's useful to be able to put a name to what you're seeing. But what's really important is you do not use logical fallacies. So specifically for your argument essay, you do not want to touch a logical fallacy. Argument is really assessing you on your logic and the quality of your logic. So if you have a logical fallacy by accident, that will deter your score. That will bring you down a little bit. So it is useful to know these just so you know what to avoid. Some common pitfalls of argument. Second, synthesis is the exact same when it comes to your own writing. Synthesis essay, which again we're starting next week, is an argument essay but with sources. So when you have anything that you're arguing, you want to completely avoid using logical fallacies in your argument. However, there is a way that logical fallacies might come into the synthesis essay, and that is you might see in one of the sources a faulty logic of some sort. So maybe you'll put a name to it. Maybe it's one of the fallacies that we look at tonight, or maybe you just point out this is flawed logic and this is why. You would only do that if you're arguing against whatever that flawed logic was arguing for. If there's flawed logic being used to support your case, don't even mention it, right? You don't say source C, here's a quote, but it's flawed. Just talk about what works for your argument. But if source C is at odds with your argument, you can point out, yeah, this is what people like source C believe, but this is why they're wrong. This is the flaw in their logic. And lastly, our third type of essay is rhetorical analysis. Don't worry about logical fallacies in rhetorical analysis. In rhetorical analysis, you want to point out what the writer is doing well. So logical fallacies are by definition bad. So you want to avoid even worrying about those in rhetorical analysis. Rhetorical analysis is all about what the author does well. Don't even worry about logical fallacies. In general, they're useful in argument and synthesis because they're what to avoid. All right, so we're going to jump right in. This should not be a super long session tonight. Our synthesis sessions will be a little bit more lengthy just because there's a lot to unpack with the synthesis essay. So that's starting next week. We're going to jump right in for tonight into our second set of logical fallacies. This is our part 2 of a 2-week series on logical fallacies, just kind of to break up our unit that we just ended in January, the very beginning of the month, on argumentation. And now we're shifting into synthesis here very soon. But let's focus the rest of the night on logical fallacies. So the first type for tonight is called the red herring. Now, this is one of the most commonly referenced logical fallacies. I hear adults all the time saying that's a red herring, even though I've never heard them labeling any other logical fallacy. I think they just kind of like it. It makes them sound smart. So here's red herring. It is a very commonly used logical fallacy. Distracting from the main premise, remember premise is a claim, so distracting from the main premise of an argument by bringing up something that's distracting information. This is very common. I will as you're watching the news, as you're just talking to friends, parents, whoever, if you hear logical fallacies, think in your head, that's flawed logic, and now I know why, or I can put words to why it is. So we see red herrings quite a lot. Red herring has a pretty cool backstory, so maybe that's also why people still like to reference this logical fallacy. No matter what their profession is, I hear people referencing red herrings all the time. So a red herring is actually a type of fish, and they're notoriously bad smelling. So the story goes that red herrings, these really nasty smelling fish, are used to train hunting dogs. So you'd send a dog on a hunt to track a scent, and then you'd throw in a red herring nearby, and if the dog could ignore the red herring, the distraction, and focus on what they were going after, that was a successful mission. That was a successful training session. So again, a red herring is a distraction, and it might be smelly, and it might be very overpowering, but as critical thinkers, we have to realize that's a distraction. I'm focusing on the actual argument. So let's look at, just like we did last week, for every logical fallacy, 3 examples of each. And then it's your job from here on out to be able to identify logical fallacies in conversation or in other people's writing. Example 1, can you take out the trash? Person 2 completely changes the subject. What's for dinner? It's sort of related, not really. I mean, the dinner waste often goes in the trash, but that's the only connection that I'm seeing here. So red herring, let's stay back on topic. Can you take out the trash? Number 2, why are you always so tired in the morning? Don't bug me, it's my birthday. All right, this is something like I hear a lot. Maybe it's from my students, so that's my experience. If I ask a tough question, they're like, this is the really random reason why I can't address that question right now. I have to go to the bathroom is another example of this. Anything that's not addressing it. Why are you always so tired in the morning? Hey, unless you are actually answering that question, you might be answering with a red herring. Lastly, this is what a student would ask me. Can I have extra credit in your class? I really deserve it. And then I would say, hey, because I don't really want to answer this question. Didn't you score 12 points at last night's basketball game? I'm changing the topic. I'm getting in the way. I'm putting out a distractor to change the scope of the argument. So in real life examples, these are maybe more conversational, obvious examples. But in real life writing examples, it's going to be maybe a little bit more subtle. Maybe this is the most subtle of the 3, even though it's not super subtle. But it's going to maybe be somewhat related or not super distant from the original topic, but it is going to shift gears and start to try to bring up something else. You'll see this in political debates all the time. We're moving quickly. I am not going to try to say this one because I've heard it pronounced 8 different ways, but this fallacy is Latin for you too. So that's what I'm going to call it, the you too fallacy. This logical fallacy points out someone's hypocrisy rather than the flaws of their argument. So you might accuse me of something, and I say, yeah, but you did this other thing wrong, so we're both wrong. That's not good logic. If you accuse me of something, I should be able to back up my reasons or defend myself or acknowledge, yeah, you caught me, this is what I did. So let's look at some examples. Jumping right in here tonight. Sure, I had an affair, but you lied to me on Christmas Day. In other words, you're not perfect either. So just because I did something wrong, hey, you did something wrong too, we're basically the same. Now this example I started because these 2 things are very, at least our society would generally agree, not equal. An affair in society we generally say is worse than a lie. So this often happens because, yeah, I did this really, really big thing, but you did this small thing, but they're both bad. So we're both bad, so we're the same. So they're trying to have false equivalency here through the you too fallacy. Let's look at a second example. How can you tell me not to drink and drive? Didn't you get a DUI when you were 21? So maybe this would be a friend talking to a friend. Maybe this would be an adult, a young adult talking to a parent. This is kind of goes back to the saying, do what I say, not what I do. People are not perfect. But the flaw in their logic here is that just because, let's say it's your dad, just because your dad messed up doesn't mean that you should mess up too. Or just because your friend messed up doesn't mean that you should drink and drive. So their premise is you should not drink and drive. You cannot counter that premise by saying, yeah, you didn't follow it. Now, is it good to be a hypocrite? Absolutely not. But when we're thinking logically, when we're thinking through the parameters of an argument, we have to attack the premise, not the person. So someone who has 7 DUIs could still tell me, don't drink and drive. And they could still tell you, don't drink and drive. And that premise is fine, even if they haven't followed that premise themselves. So I can't just attack them, and I can't call them a hypocrite. I have to see if that premise lines up or not. Now, a quick side note. Last week we started with the ad hominem fallacy. That is attacking the person, not the argument. That is similar here. In fact, the U2 fallacy is maybe a more specific type of an ad hominem argument. It's attacking hypocrisy specifically. All right, our final example for U2 fallacy. Don't worry about me not studying for my finals. You're the one who dropped out of college. So maybe a college student or a high school student would be saying this to an older friend, brother, sister, cousin, family member, parent. Just because they dropped out, again, doesn't mean the premise is wrong that you should study for your finals. So don't attack the person. Don't call them a hypocrite. Even if that's the case, point out the premise. Now, let's just be clear. Is calling out someone for hypocrisy, could it be part of argument? Absolutely. But your counter cannot singularly rely on the fact that you're calling them out for being a hypocrite. Maybe you'll say, yeah, they're losing some credibility here, but just because you are less credible than the next person doesn't mean that your premise might not be legit. All right, we're moving quickly here tonight to causal fallacy. Falsely identifying a cause. We'll see this all the time, so we're going to jump right in to some examples. So example 1, yesterday it rained while I took my math tests and I did great. I hope it rains tomorrow while I take my history test. Okay, like we'll see this all the time. Superstition kind of comes into play here. I'm a baseball fan, so baseball is notorious for having baseball players, especially in the major leagues, who are very superstitious. And some of that comes from just kind of playing it up, but sometimes they actually just don't want to jinx anything. So we've heard stories about, well, I wore these socks on Monday and I hit a home run. I'm going to wear these socks on Tuesday. I do pretty well on Tuesday. Hey, I'm going to wear these socks on Wednesday. I'm going to wear these socks on Thursday. And they're going to keep wearing those dirty socks without washing them because they want to keep it exactly the same until maybe they have a bad game. Okay, guess the socks aren't working anymore. I'll try something new. We hear about this all the time. So superstition is very similar here. Well, in this example, we see the flaw in this logic. Just because it rained outside did not mean that was the reason why you did great on your math test. Every time, this is more the superstition example, every time John wears his running shoes, he goes running. Those running shoes must really motivate him to run. Sorry, this is not the superstition example. This is just a false cause. It's kind of, this one's kind of the which came first, the chicken or the egg example. So which came first? John running? Or sorry, John putting on his running shoes, or John deciding to run? Let me say it again just to make sure that's sinking. Which came first? John putting on the running shoes or deciding to run? Well, most likely, this is where the faulty logic comes in here. This is the way humans work. We decide to do something, and then we do it, generally speaking. So John decided, hey, it's a nice day. I'm going to go for a run. And then the next step is he puts on his running shoes. He probably did not, and that's kind of the premise here is, in this faulty example, oh, look, I have my running shoes on. I might as well go for a run. That's not happening here. That's false logic or faulty logic. Lastly, your name is Leia. Well, your parents must be huge Star Wars fans. Now, that's possible, but we can't jump to that conclusion. So this one is kind of the jumping to conclusions example. So first we talked about superstition. Second, we talked about like the which came first. And third is just taking a leap where a leap isn't due. So drawing a conclusion when a conclusion is not necessarily able to be drawn. So causal fallacy actually has a lot of different types under that big umbrella of this logical fallacy. Again, maybe your name is Leia and your parents didn't even watch Star Wars. It is possible. All right, our next one's kind of a weird term or weird name, fallacy of sunk costs. So let's talk about the fallacy and then let's talk about the origin of the name. So the definition here is thinking you should complete a task because of time that you have already sunk into it. Think of this as the stubborn fallacy. I know a lot of stubborn people. Sometimes I am stubborn and I just want to stick with things because I've already started them, even when it would be better if I cut my losses. Well, that's where the sunk cost name comes from. It's an economic term, so we're talking money here. Sunk cost is an economic term describing past expenses that cannot be recovered. So let's say I put $1,000 into this stock and immediately it loses $300. And my advisor calls me and says, hey, Kevin, I have bad news. This stock is on its way out. It's probably going to keep going down. You should get out now. But I'm too stubborn. I say, I've lost $300, so I have a sunken cost. But I did invest, and I really want to get that money back. So let's just ride it out. So that's a fallacy of thought, and that's why you definitely don't want to use this kind of fallacy in your investments and economics of any sort. The thing that I should do is cut my loss and get out. But what I might do is say, I'll just try to make my money back. And 2 weeks later, I might have $300 instead of $1,000 because it keeps going down. So I should have got out and only lost $300. Meanwhile, I was stubborn and I lost $700. Now let's see how the fallacy of sunken costs applies to logic. So example 1. I think I could start over and write 3 new, better novels in the time that it would take me to finish this one. But I've been working on it since 10th grade, so I have to finish. So just because you started something doesn't mean you have to finish. In fact, even if you spent 1,000 hours doing something, doing this project, it doesn't mean that you should spend the next 100 hours doing it. Maybe you should spend the next 100 hours doing something new that you'll actually be more successful at. So that's the fallacy here. Here's another kind of a tougher one. I spent 15 years with my spouse, so I'm going to stick it out even though my marriage is horrible. Well, maybe the last 15 years were terrible, but just because they were bad doesn't mean the next 15 have to be bad. Hear me, this is not a comment on divorce. This is a comment on logic. Maybe you should stick out this marriage, but this is not the reason why. And we hear this a lot. Well, I've always done it, so I'm going to keep doing it this way. That is faulty logic. Maybe get into the real reason of why you should keep doing it, and just analyze, should I keep doing it? Whatever it is. Lastly, this is a true story from my students last year who were also in physics. So let's look at it. I have dumped 12 hours into making this egg launcher work. I have to get it right. So I had 4 students. It was a group project. I did not teach physics, but they were in physics, and they were also in my AP language and composition class. They came into my room 4 days in a row after school for probably 2.5 hours each night or each afternoon. So can we work in your room? That's fine, I said. And I was just kind of in and out getting my work done. And I noticed they were just really focused on getting this one project right. It would have, by Tuesday, they should have recognized this would be easier if we just start over. Would it be frustrating? Yeah, because we had spent 4 hours at that point on this project. But the reality is, if they had started over, the project probably would have taken them 3 or 4 hours. Because they did not start over, and they had to keep backtracking and figuring out what went wrong, the project took them 12 hours. So at the 4th hour, if they would have started over and took 4 more hours, that would have calculated 8 hours. Now it took them 12 hours, and I'll be honest, they still didn't get it to work right. Every other group did, so it's not like it was a super hard project. They were just way too stubborn here. So just because you have done something or invested a little bit into something doesn't mean you should or want to stick it out. So that's the fallacy of sunk costs. All right, appeal to authority. Citing irrelevant or false authorities as evidence for a claim. This happens a lot, and commercials use the appeal to authority to sell us products. We'll talk about some of those here. So again, it's when somebody's not an expert on the topic in which they are addressing. Example one is LeBron James. He has a lot of Sprite commercials. So I drink Sprite because LeBron James drinks Sprite, or is their spokesman. All right, let's be honest. LeBron James, and we're getting the commercial right here. LeBron James drinks Sprite because he gets paid to drink Sprite. All right, let's put that out there first, right? But second, LeBron telling me to drink Sprite is not a good enough reason why, because he is not an authority in that field. So let's keep moving. This is also true back in the 80s. Hulk Hogan always told you to eat your vitamins. So vitamins are important. Hulk Hogan says so. Well, let's unpack this. Actually, Hulk Hogan probably took vitamins of some sort. He's probably on, I don't know what he was on, but it was back in the 80s. Things were not as regulated. I'm sure he was taking some sort of enhancers, right? But the vitamins that he was selling were like children's vitamins. He is not the best authority on health, even though he was super successful. A better authority on what your child should be intaking are like pediatricians, doctors, etc. Now, here's a very important point. I actually believe that the premise is true. Vitamins are important. But this is a bad reason. So I, as the arguer, have to put in better logic than that wrestler on TV says so. I have to do more work here. I have to find someone more credible, maybe find other support, maybe a longitudinal study on why vitamins are important. Now, granted, on our timed essays, it's hard to go cite research, but in synthesis, that is what we do. They're going to give you on your synthesis prompt, and we'll see this in the next few weeks, some sources that are super useful and some sources that you can use, but you have to be careful of how you're using them. If you just randomly and blindly cite sources that conveniently line up, you are not thinking hard enough about this topic. So you do have to be thinking, why is this premise true, and how can I really effectively think about it? So that's in part why I wanted to do logical fallacies last week and this week before launching into synthesis. So even if the premise is true, we have to make sure the support or the reasoning is true as well. And lastly, Star Wars is better than Star Trek. Just ask George Lucas. Well, clearly George Lucas is the creator of Star Wars. He's going to have a bias. So I just want to throw this one in here as well as an example. If an authority is biased, they lose credibility. They are not a great reference. So if you would have asked my parents, is Kevin a great guy? They're going to say yeah, but they're not the best evidence around because they are pretty biased. They raised me. They hope I'm a great guy. They want me to be a great guy. With that said, if you ask somebody who's not as invested in me if I'm a great guy and they say yes, then maybe we're moving somewhere. Maybe we have better support. All right. Our next example is equivocation. This is a word or phrase that is used to deliberately confuse someone. So just trying to confuse you intentionally to try to muddy the waters. This happens a lot in politics as well. So you're just going to see these a lot because politics is all about argument, but also just getting as many people as possible to agree with you on something. So sometimes they don't care if their support or their reasoning is right. They care if they ultimately get you on your side or on their side. So the root word here is equal and voice. Let's go ahead and look at some examples. A pastor told me, so this would be an example of this logical fallacy. The pastor told me to have faith. I have faith that I will not be going back to his church. I guess he'll be happy with me. So it's kind of muddying the waters. Obviously, the double meaning on faith here is why this becomes a logical fallacy. Clearly, we're taking the pastor's words out of context when we say the faith that the pastor wants is having faith that you're not going back to church. So kind of a play on words is a very common type of this logical fallacy. All right. Same here, play on words. She told me to stop lying. I'm not lying, I'm standing. And then you might go on to tell a lie. All right. So again, twisting someone's words or using a pun or play on words to get your way is not effective reasoning. And lastly, he said, and this is what my students often say, quit playing me. Well, I'm playing Monopoly, so he should be happy. All right, again, play on words. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but I did want to make sure we saw that one. I want to move right to appeal to pity and really focus on, think about where you've seen this. Now, let's be clear here. I want to spend some time thinking about this one. So appeal to pity is manipulating someone's emotion to get them on your side of an argument. There is a fine line between this as a logical fallacy and this is an effective rhetoric tool. Pathos, we said all year, is an appeal to someone's emotion. And we usually say that in a positive way. So where the line is crossed is when it's used for deliberate manipulation. And let's just be clear. If your only support is emotional, reasoning, and support, you are not doing your job as a coherent, logical arguer. That's why we started with Fiveable and probably in your AP class, looking at the rhetorical triangle. Ethos, pathos, logos, all three need to be present in order to be most effective. Ethos being credibility, logos being logic. That's the main thing for every logical fallacy. We don't have logical fallacies, we want to have logic. And then lastly, emotions. So appeal to pity is taking it too far, maybe leaving all logic aside in order to manipulate emotions. I think we see that often in our day-to-day life. This exact logical fallacy is very common. So here's an example that I heard many people say in my childhood, and I still hear people saying today: eat your food. There are starving children in the world. In other words, guilt you into eating your broccoli, right? Well, let's be honest. If I don't eat my food, there will still be starving children in the world. So that's where the logic is not lining up. If you're really concerned about starving children in the world, the question should be, what are you doing about it? If you really want me to eat my food, the question is, give me a better reason why. All right. Example 2. While you go to bed tonight in your luxurious studio apartment in your queen-size bed, this poor dog will be in a 2-foot by 2-foot metal box at the shelter. Maybe the next line would be, please adopt this dog. Now, should this dog be taken care of? Absolutely. Should this dog be adopted by a loving owner? Absolutely. But give me a better reason than you have a nice apartment with a nice bed. That's where the appeal to pity is taking over too much. Can I show you this dog and say, oh, this dog's going to be in rough conditions until he's adopted? Absolutely. Then tell me logically why I should adopt him. Maybe I need more than just some manipulation here. Lastly, if you break up with me, I'll never recover. So the premise here is you should not break up with me because I will never recover. Like, that's the reason why. That is not a good enough reason to not break up with you or break up with me. So if you want to break up with me, tell me, logically, you're going to tell me why it's best for both of us, or at least you. Maybe it's not best for me. All right, maybe this is a sore subject. So the point is, if you break up with me, I'll never recover is manipulation of emotion, trying to hold on to the relationship. Don't do that. Emotions are valid. Emotions are going to be a part of every relationship, right? Emotions are an important ingredient of any argument. But if they take over and they start to become manipulative, it turns into a logical fallacy. You need to make sure it's well balanced. Logic, credibility, emotion. This is actually our last one tonight, Bandwagon Appeal. Assuming something is right simply because other people agree with it. Now, this is probably the number one term that a lot of students know, even going back to middle school. And it is a very common logical fallacy. Let's make it clear. Just because a lot of people are doing something doesn't make it wrong. The point here is it also just doesn't make it right. So you have to use better logic than, well, 10 other people are doing it too. So let's look at some examples, and then we'll actually start to wrap up tonight. Michael Jordan is the best basketball player of all time. It was proven in an ESPN audience poll. So Michael Jordan very well may be the best basketball player of all time. So the premise still might be correct. but this is bad logic. The 400 people that took a random midday ESPN poll do not have final say on who is the best basketball player of all time. So that is where the logic breaks down. My entire family voted for the Democratic candidate for governor. Therefore, she must have been the best choice. Okay, just because your family or just because a lot of people voted this way doesn't make it the best choice. So maybe she was the best choice, but I need to hear more in order to know. So bandwagon appeal is like all of these logical fallacies. They are a vast oversimplification of logic. And therefore, there's a lot of gaps in their faulty logic. Our last example here. 9 out of 10 seniors in high school voted for early dismissal from school every Friday. Therefore, it must be the best policy. Well, let's actually talk about this as our last one. This might be useful information. And in fact, a survey in which 90% of the seniors vote for something should be taken seriously and should be valid. But it can't be the only data point. That's where the logical fallacy stands. It's right because everyone thinks it's right or most people think it's right is not good enough logic. So we need more here. I guess to wrap up, the main point is that you want to make sure you are using a full breadth of logic. You can't just say one thing and think that it's going to do your job. Okay, so I did see a question, so we're going to wrap up here. Just basically reminding what is a logical fallacy. So I just wanted to make sure we end on that before we move into synthesis for next week. So again, a logical fallacy is just the term that we've given to faulty logic. This week and last week, between the two, we went over 15 logical fallacies, just to put a name to the common trend of logic flaw. But a logical fallacy, in short, is simply put faulty logic. Logic that there's a claim and there's reasoning, but it doesn't line up. The reasoning doesn't effectively prove the claim. So go back to our argumentation unit. As long as you are a subscriber, you can see any of our resources at any time. Go back at any time this year. And I think the most useful would probably be a couple of the argumentation presentations. So the body paragraph presentation would be really useful of what to do with logic. The last 2 weeks is really what not to do with logic. And the other one's probably the very introductory live session to argumentation would be useful as well. All right, everybody, have a great rest of the week. I'm looking forward to starting synthesis with you all next week, so I hope you can attend our live session next Tuesday. All right, have a good rest of the night, everybody.